So let's go to the next point then, and that is to show you that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. There are physical reasons to think that it cannot do what is claimed for it. And there's lots and lots of problems for Darwin's theory. But one of them, a prominent one of them, is one I wrote about in a book coming up on 20 years ago now. And it focuses on a problem that Darwin himself pointed out in his book, The Origin of Species. In The Origin of Species, Darwin wrote a section called Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication, where he was talking about the vertebrate eye and other very sophisticated systems. And he wrote, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, adding, but I can find out no such case. Now, in this passage, Darwin was emphasizing that his was a gradual theory, that evolution had to proceed slowly, in tiny steps, over long periods of time, because he knew if life improved quickly in big leaps, then it would look suspiciously as if something other than random mutations were involved. So let's take Darwin at his word and ask ourselves, well, what sorts of systems sure don't look like they could be produced by numerous successive slight modifications? Well, systems that fit that requirement are ones that I term irreducibly complex, or have the property of irreducible complexity. Now, irreducible complexity is a fancy phrase, and I made it up to make people think I was smart. Hasn't worked yet. But it stands for a simple idea. It just means that you've got some organ or machine or system that has a number of different parts. And all of the parts have to interact with each other to produce a function that couldn't have been produced by itself. And if you take away one of them, then the system breaks down. And again, that's a bunch of words. So let's look at an example of what I mean by that from our everyday life, not from biology yet. And one that fits the bill is shown here. And this is just a plain old ordinary mechanical mousetrap that you might get at a hardware store. And a mousetrap has a number of different parts. It's got a big wooden platform to which all the other parts are attached. It's got this tightly wound spring with an extended end here and another extended end that hooks over this other metal part, which is called the hammer, which actually squashes the mouse. And you have to push the hammer over to get it in position, and it has to be stabilized there, and that's the job of something called the holding bar. And the end of the holding bar has to be stabilized by inserting it into the catch. Now, the mousetrap needs all these parts to work. If it were missing the spring or the hammer or the catch, you would not have a trap that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to. You would have a broken mousetrap. It would not work at all. So this is what I mean by irreducibly complex. Turns out that irreducibly complex systems are real hard to envision being produced by the gradual process that Darwin required for his evolutionary mechanism. I mean, if you wanted to produce something like a mousetrap by something like a Darwinian evolutionary process, how would you do that? Where would you start? Maybe we would start with just the platform and hope to catch mice inefficiently. Maybe trip them as they ran over the platform. And then maybe you could improve it. Maybe you could add another piece, maybe the holding bar, and maybe then when they tripped they could impale themselves on the end of the holding bar. No, that's silly. It can't work like that, because with irreducibly complex systems, the function only appears when the system has essentially been put together. That's a big problem for Darwinian theory, because natural selection then has nothing to select until you finish the system. And if you finish the system, then you don't need it anymore in any event. Well, mousetraps are very interesting. I think about them a lot. But what we really want to know is, are there any irreducibly complex biological systems? Cellular systems, or now that science has shown that the real foundational level of life are cells and molecules, are there any such irreducibly complex biochemical systems? And the answer is, yeah, they're all over the place. You can't open up a biochemistry textbook without encountering such things. And my favorite visual example of irreducible complexity at the molecular level is something called the bacterial flagellum, which is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got a number of parts. This part over here acts as the propeller. It's kind of a whip-like propeller, and it's spun around and around and around. And as it spins around, it pushes against the water, and that pushes the bacterium forward. And the propeller is attached to the drive shaft by something called the hook region, which acts as a universal joint, allowing the transmission of rotation in this plane to the plane of the propeller. The drive shaft itself is attached to the motor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside to power its turning, kind of like water flowing over a dam can turn a turbine. The whole thing has to be kept in place, and a number of parts, protein parts of the apparatus act as stator material, just like clamps and screws will keep an outboard motor on a boat in our everyday world. Other parts of the structure act as bushing material, allowing the drive shaft to pass through the bacterial membrane and not leak. And there are many other parts that I can't talk about right now. And I know this looks complex, but let me assure you this is just a little cartoon image of this machine, and that it has to have many other parts and many other features that we don't have time to talk about in order to actually work. Now, I like to show people this picture of a flagellum, which is taken from a popular college biochemistry textbook, because most people, when they look at it, quickly realize that this is a machine. This is not like a machine. This is not analogous to a machine. This is a real molecular machine. And maybe our knowledge of where machines come from can aid us in trying to figure out where this thing may have come from too. Another thing I'd like to point out is that perhaps you can see that the flagellum, like a mousetrap, is irreducibly complex. Take away the propeller, take away the drive shaft, the universal joint, any of the parts of the structure, and you don't get a flagellum that spins half as fast as it used to, or a quarter as fast as it used to. You have a broken flagellum. Or, much more likely, you don't get a flagellum at all, because in addition to this, the cell has sophisticated feedback mechanisms to monitor the construction of this machine, and it will shut down construction to save energy if it senses that things are not going well. So like the mousetrap, the flagellum is irreducibly complex, and much like its evolutionary construction by numerous successive slight modifications randomly in a Darwinian sense is very difficult to envision. Well, is the flagellum some freak of nature? Is it something, whoa, that's there, but pretty much nothing else is like it? Well, no. It turns out that almost everything at the molecular level in the cell is like this. The big story of 20th century biology is the discovery that our lives are based on machines. Just kind of like anybody here ever watch a TV show called Star Trek? Oh, yeah, there are a few. And in one of the later incarnations, there was a race of beings called the Borg, you may remember. And the Borg were run by nanotechnology. They had these little machines in them. Well, believe it or not, in that sense, we are the Borg. We are run by little machines. Our physical bodies are run by tiny, very sophisticated machines. But no, this is not the only example. For example, here's a cover of the journal Cell, which is a professional biology journal from the late 1990s, a special issue on macromolecular machines. And if you turn the page and look at the table of contents, you see articles with titles such as "The Cell is a Collection of Protein Machines," "Polymerases in the Replisome," "Machines Within Machines," "Mechanical Devices of the Spliceosome," "Motors, Clocks, Springs, and Things." Let me go back to that cover. And if you look at it closely, on the lower left, you'll see something that looks a lot like William Paley's watch, which has been discovered in the cell. So that was the point, that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. There are physical reasons to thinking that, that the theory cannot explain what its proponents claim for it. So the next point is that those grand Darwinian claims, not little Darwinian claims, I want to emphasize that Darwinian process can explain some things, and I don't have time to talk about that tonight. But those grand Darwinian claims that it can account for the basis of life rest on undisciplined imagination.